Apocalypse is a poem from the collection of poems titled Apocalypse 83, written by the Sri Lankan poet Jean Arasanayagam. Before I proceed further, I would like to give you the meaning of the word apocalypse. It's a word that indicates the end of the world. Something so destructive that it appears the world will come to an end or it has ended. So, Jean Arasanayagam, I have already discussed in my previous lecture about her biography, but there are a few more aspects which I would like to cover before I analyze the poem in this lecture. So, Jean Arasanayagam, born on 2nd December 1931, was a leading Sri Lankan poet. She passed away on July 30th, 2019 after a brief illness. She was a uniquely political writer whose poetic identities were forged and shaped in the volatile ordeals of the ethnic conflicts that she has gone through and that have marked Sri Lanka in the 1980s. Arasanayagam was awarded the Sahitya Ratna by the Sri Lankan government in 2017 for her contributions to literature and the Premchand Fellowship from the Sahitya Academy in India in 2014. She was also a recipient of the Grecian Prize, the most prestigious award for Sri Lankan writing in English, for her poetry collection, The Life of the Poet. She had an MLit in literary linguistics from a university in Glasgow, and she taught English at various institutions in Sri Lanka. She was also a painter who exhibited her work at exhibitions in Colombo and also in London. A deeply sensitive investigator of identity, Arasanayagam spanned multitude heritages in her poetry, and she sought to chart a cartographic course that would surpass the ethno-nationalist boundaries. Her poems mark analysis, understanding about the concept of identity, individual nationality, belongingness to a great extent. One significant personal reason for her immense interest in understanding identity, individuality, or belongingness is her marriage to a Tamilian from Jaffna, another minority group in Sri Lanka, that additionally provided her a deep insight into the way how identity counts a lot in survival and in relationships. The Tamils are a numerically significant and politically active minority in Sri Lanka. However, Arasanayagam also had to adapt to the stringent and social structures or traditional norms, customs as an outsider. So that's what she goes for describing in some of her poems as well, how identity becomes a great marker. So each crisis of identity, displacement, and belonging does not dispel her. Rather, it simply sets her apart in her liminal space, that is, the transitional space from where she tries to analyze, interrogate the questions on identity with more insight and foresight. Owing to this, her poetry was deeply personal in its imaginaries, but the terrain is explored and it was not just merely personal. In fact, Arasanayagam witnessed the violence during Black July, the anti-Tamil pogrom. The meaning of the word pogrom is, a kind of organized killing of large number of people because of their race or religion. So she witnessed the anti-Tamil pogrom in Sri Lanka in 1983 and had to flee to a refugee camp with a family on account of her husband's Tamil lineage. So according to one critic, Arasanayagam's poetry is uniquely linked to identity documentation and alienation, and that's what she captures beautifully through her selected vocabulary and very selective themes. In the poem Apocalypse, the poet shows the importance of not having identity markers and how these divisions can result in certain bad outcomes at the end. The whole poem is about the brutality of violence, and it gives a comprehensive picture of what happened during the 1980s. Arasanayagam criticizes the hegemonic politics in Sri Lanka that sparked anger and hate within the ethnicities. She depicts the aggression and mass killings by using very striking expressions. But at the same time, it is important to note her poetic sensibility that she has used general identity markers such as humans, we, they, man, and corpses of husbands, wives, children, instead of using ethnic markers. In spite of the fact that Jean Arasanayagam herself is a victim, she is also a watcher and uh, a questioner, a painter with an eye for the details of landscape. In comparison to the other poems like Nallur, The Cry of the Kite, the changes are portrayed brutally or violently in the poem Apocalypse 83. So we get to see the horror and bitterness, the mass killings, the brutality depicted by the poet, no doubt without using personal or ethnic markers. So, in this poem, rather than temples slowly crumbling, there are plundered, burning houses. Rather than the sorrow and bitterness and estrangement and decay, there is the horror of those who have been packed together in school and corridors and classrooms. Their pyres, their corpses are there lying around in the city or on the shores of the peninsula. Jean Arasanayagam powerfully communicates the way in which the nation is territorialized. She gives a vivid picture of the violence that takes place during the war. As part of the ethnic community, she highlights the struggles in her poetry collections, Apocalypse 83, Trial by Error, and others. She agrees that 1983 was a significant event in her literary career, and a note of urgency and political awareness emerges in her poems that were written post 1983. In an interview with Jean Arasanayagam on aspects of culture in Sri Lanka by Robinson, she says the Holocaust of 1983 inspired Apocalypse. According to her, I quote, I felt the verses from Revelations, images of lakes burning with fire and sulfur, death, and the world of the dead, also the visions of the armies killed by the sword. As a matter of fact, I wrote Apocalypse after my return from the refugee camp in Kandy, the city I was born in and lived in during the period of the racial riots. I was there with other Tamils and those who were, like myself, married to Tamils and had offspring of divided blood. Unquote. Owing to its appeal and the depiction of the brutal killings and popularity, Apocalypse, that was published originally in 1984, was republished in 2003. So, Apocalypse 83 is arguably Arasanayagam's most well known work, and it continues to provide an important personal narrative and insight into the violence of the Civil War, particularly the differences among the natives of the period. This poem reflects on the devastating impacts of war and its aftermath. The poem can be broadly divided into 4 stanzas, each of which offers a different perspective on the theme. So, in the first section, we can identify the poet describes the horror of war and its effects on the natural world. The imagery is vivid, with references to rivers of blood and trees uprooted. The poet emphasizes the senselessness of war and the way it destroys everything in its path. Then it shifts to a more personal perspective as the poet reflects on the impact of war on individual lives. The focus is on the emotional and psychological trauma suffered by those who have experienced war. The poet describes the shattered lives and broken dreams of those who have lived through war, emphasizing the lasting impact of the experience. Then the poet turns to the idea of hope and the possibility of rebuilding after war. The imagery here is more hopeful with references to seeds of hope and new beginnings. The poet suggests that even in the midst of destruction, there is the potential for renewal and growth. The poet also returns to the theme of the natural world as she reflects on the ways in which the earth itself can be a source of healing and renewal. The emphasis here is on the cyclical nature of life and the idea that even in the face of destruction, there is always the possibility of regeneration and rebirth. So, overall, Apocalypse is a powerful, moving poem that speaks to the devastating impact of war on both the natural world and the individual lives. The poem is notable for its vivid imagery and its ability to convey a sense of both despair and hope. Through its exploration of the theme of destruction and renewal, the poem ultimately suggests that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of new beginnings.